Welcome back. Our final session, session 3, Overcoming Barriers to Meeting Farm Household and Farm Business Goals, will feature 3 presentations. First, we have Dr. Catherine Lim, a research economist with USDA's Economic Research Service, where she studies farm households, will present her paper entitled Farm Households and Retirement, Income Sources and Savings Behavior. Renee Wyatt, who is the Research and Extension Specialist for the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development and the Family Business Management Specialist for the Purdue Institute for Family Business, housed in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University, and Dr. Maria Marshall, Professor in the James and Lois Ackerman Endowed Chair in Agricultural Economics at Purdue, will present Rich and Ready to Go or Stay and Grow, a succession preparedness study of U.S. farmers in the North Central region. Dr. Tia McDonald, a research agricultural economist at the Economic Research Service, will present her paper, Distance to Commercial Banks and Farm Household Use of Financial Services. The discussion will be moderated by Shoshana Inwood, who we heard from at the beginning of the day. She is a rural sociologist and associate professor in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. Hand it over to you, Shoshana.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, great.
Well, we're super excited for this session today. And just as a reminder, we encourage everybody to please put questions in the Q&A box and also in the chat. And so we'll just get started with Catherine Lim's presentation.
Thanks. I'm Catherine Lim, and I'm a USDA research economist with the Economic Research Service. And this is joint work with one of my colleagues, Ashley Spalding, and it's about farm households and retirement. And I just need to say the standard disclaimer that everything I say today is my own opinion and not necessarily that of USDA's. Next slide. Okay, so the motivation behind this paper is similar to some of the other papers in this conference. So we know that U.S. farmers are aging. So in our data, we found that 45% of principal operators were 65 years of age or older in 2021. And it's not just that they're older, but actually the distribution is shifting up, which speaks maybe to some of the beginning and young farmer issues that we talked about earlier today. But between 2018 and 2021, the average age of principal operators actually increased by 2.5 years. And so this has implications for both the farm household and the farm business, which is the focus of the conference. So on the farm household side, retirement preparedness and planning for retirement is going to influence these farm households' well-being in future years when they may no longer be farming, may be fully retired. But we also know that succession planning and having well-integrated succession planning with retirement planning is what's going to ensure business continuity on the farm business side, as well as success, however the farmer decides that looks like after they're done farming. Okay, so the reason we wanted to study farmers is we actually think that farmers and their households have some unique retirement challenges, but also some unique opportunities. So they're a little different from, average, say, American households. They are business owners, which provides them with some additional sources of income, which could be a good thing. But those sources of income, sorry, back a slide. But those sources of income can have a different risk profile than, say, general assets held in, say, retirement accounts, or the types of assets that typical American households might have. And they might also have some potential income streams in retirement arising from, say, land ownership, being able to rent out that land that the average American household would not have access to. They also tend to work beyond a typical retirement age. As I mentioned, many farmers are over 65 when a lot of individuals retire. And there's an idiosyncratic nature to farm succession that also, I think, poses some risk to farmers in thinking about retirement. So, as has been mentioned in the conference, many farmers want to pass along their farm business to a family member. And that's a pretty different idea with a ton of different considerations than just having an asset that you're going to sell to a third party to the highest bidder, let's say. And then finally, this has come up too in the conference, that median total farm household income is actually higher than median household income in the US as a whole. And so that does pose some opportunities to think about how farm households could adequately prepare for retirement security. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just as some background on work that's already been done in this topic, I think the most similar work to this has been done by Mishra, Durst, and Al-Assa. These were ERS researchers and they did some work looking at income, assets, and retirement contributions. But this is also work that's linked to the much broader farm succession literature. We've just listed a few papers here written by people in the audience. This is obviously not exhaustive, but there's some things that have come out of this literature, which have been mentioned somewhat already today. So the majority of U.S. farmers are planning on transferring their farm to a family member. And there's some research that suggests that succession planning may be less universal or complete than desired. As I mentioned, an integration between succession planning and retirement planning is important for thinking about farm household well-being and the business success in the future. But there's some evidence that farmers, even older farmers, have not necessarily come up with a detailed succession plan. And then I think the research suggests that that is really important because it finds linkages between succession planning and farm operations, finding that, farms that have identified a successor are more dynamic, they're investing in their farms, and they're perhaps more successful, although the causal linkage could go either way, right? Like having a successful farm makes it easier to find a successor, perhaps. Next page. Okay, so our contribution in this work is to update information on farm households' income sources, their assets owned, and retirement contributions. So we're going to explore differences in these measures across demographics of the principal operator, so their age, their race and ethnicity, and then how dependent the farm household is on farm income. We're going to compare farm households to American households more generally and other self-employed households, just to get a sense of how their retirement income sources and assets look compared to the average U.S. household, and then finally discuss some implications for the retirement security of farm households. Next slide. So our primary data source is USDA's Agricultural Resource Management Survey. ARMS has been talked about a bit today at the conference already. It's a representative cross-section of farm operations for 48 contiguous states once you use the appropriate weights. It's important to note that to be in the sample, it requires $1,000 of agricultural sales or expected sales. So it includes, I would say, relatively small farm operations, but importantly, it excludes, say, farm operators who are no longer producing anything. So completely retired, they were a farmer, but they are no longer producing agricultural output. We're going to pool 2018 through 2021 data and just combine them to have a bigger sample size. We'll say more. And importantly, this data source includes detailed information both on the household side, but also the farm business side, which, as has been discussed, is somewhat difficult to find a data source that combines these two things. Okay, next slide. The other data set we're going to use is the CPS from the annual Social and Economic Supplement. And think of this as a representative cross-section of U.S. households generally, once it's appropriately weighted. We pooled 2019 through 2022 data, so it's 1 year later, but it's a similar time period. And these data are going to include individual and household income sources, as well as detailed demographics about the household. Okay, so we're going to study income and assets at a household level, and part of that's because we're interested in the household, but also part of that's because ARMS asks these questions at a household level. We're going to look both at income sources and dependency on those income sources. So think of that as like the flow coming into the household, as well as the underlying assets and net worth, and think of that as like the stock of wealth, that they're drawing from. And we're going to focus on retirement income and assets, and as I mentioned, examine differences among older households based on different demographics. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'm just going to start with all farm households and give you a sense of income and asset distributions for all farm households. And go to the next slide. Thanks. Okay, so this is a detailed breakdown of income sources and assets across farm households from the ARMS data set. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you income sources. And so what this is it's showing you the average share of income coming from that source across farm households. So you can see that off-farm wages and salaries are really important in terms of income sources. It makes up on average 44% of households' income. And the farm business itself is only making up 2%. And that's come up a bunch in today's conference. The fact that there are a lot of farm households actually making losses from their farm business, and that there's a heavy reliance on off-farm wages and salaries for a lot of farm households. Farm households are also getting a lot of income from what we call in ARMS public sources, and this includes Social Security, unemployment insurance, and veterans benefits. So on average, the farm household gets 20% of their income from those sources. And I want to contrast that with what we see on the asset side. So on the asset side, on the right-hand side, you see that on average, farm households are getting 56%, or have 56% of their underlying assets in the farm. And that does include some things that you might think of as personal assets, like if the dwelling is owned by the farm, that would fall under that 56%. But it's pretty different from income sources, right? So they're holding a lot of their wealth in the farm, but they're not necessarily drawing every year, getting a lot of income sources from that farm. They also, in terms of off-farm assets, the largest category is retirement accounts. So they have about 11% of their wealth in retirement accounts. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how the composition of income changes over the life cycle. And you can think of this as obviously these are different people. It's a cohort analysis, but you can think of it sort of like a life cycle analysis by looking at different ages of the principal operator. And here I've just divided income into 3 categories just to make things simpler. There's farm income, there's off-farm income, less retirement income, and retirement income. It has an asterisk here because ARMS is not perfect at measuring retirement income. As you'll see, like it's strange that young people have what I'm calling retirement income, but it includes, as I mentioned, public sources. So things like unemployment insurance or veterans benefits. And then we also included interest and dividends generally, which may or may not be coming from retirement sources. But nonetheless, you can see that that share of retirement income is rising throughout the life cycle. And so it is representing, I think, a lot of retirement sources. And among farm households where the principal operator is 70 or older, they're receiving 56% on average of their income from those sources. So you can see the big decline over the life cycle is the off-farm income, less retirement, which a lot of that's going to be the wage and salary employment. Okay, next slide. So things look a little bit different, I think, if we look at assets. So the black line here is telling you the average assets across the different age categories, and you can see it grows over time, which you would expect as people are gaining assets as they're getting older. But we found it to be interesting that actually it looks like the distribution of those assets isn't changing much over the life cycle, which is suggesting that individuals are saving, but they're saving both, or they're investing both in their farm, they're investing in their non-farm, less retirement assets, and they're also investing in retirement accounts. And here retirement actually means retirement accounts. So you can see that young people have pretty low levels of assets in retirement accounts. It grows a little bit, but remains relatively stable as a share until you get to 70 plus, where there's a little bit of a drawdown in their retirement assets, which makes sense because as we saw from income sources, they are drawing down some of those retirement accounts and using it as income in the 70 plus category. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to focus just on older households. So this is farm households where the principal operator is 65 years or older. Go to the next slide. So we wanted to compare farmers in ARMS to older Americans in general. So to do this, we use the CPS. Here we're looking at CPS households where the head of household is between the ages of 65 or 70 or 70 plus to compare it to our ARMS farm households. And you can see that the farm households have average total income that's higher than those in the CPS. And part of that's because, as I mentioned, they do have to still be producing at least, say $1,000 in expected sales. And so they're not necessarily completely retired. But when we look at average retirement income, the ARMS households do have higher levels of it. But when we look at it as a share of income, we see that at least for the 70 plus, it looks relatively similar in their reliance on retirement sources and their reliance on retirement sources of income. And so they don't actually look so different, I think, from general American households in the CPS. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here what I'm doing is looking only within CPS. So looking only within this data sources and not using ARMS. Farmers here are households who are receiving some farm income in this CPS data source. And so I wanted to compare them to other self-employed older workers. So everyone's 65 and older here. So the first 3 columns are people who are working. They have some sort of, earned income. They either have wage and salary income, they have business income from not a farm, or they have farm income. And if they have farm income, they can also have wage and salary income. And then I want to compare that to the fourth column. Those are retired individuals, so individuals who don't have any earned income. So you can see the retired individuals look pretty different. They have relatively low levels of income, and they're very reliant on retirement sources, which makes sense because they're not working. But farmers don't look too different from other older workers and other older business owners in terms of their levels of income, their retirement income, and the share of their income that's represented from retirement sources. And so this was sort of interesting to us that farm households didn't look so different from other older working households. Next slide. And next we wanted to compare assets. So I was talking about income. We actually see that in our data in ARMS, among ARMS households that are older than 65, 73% have positive retirement account balances. So they are participating in retirement accounts. Part of that might be through their off-farm income. Part of that could be through self-employed plans that they've set up themselves. And it's not so different from the general population where 58% of slightly younger workers had access to an employer plan, defined benefit plan, or an IRA. And when we look at their retirement balances in ARMS, we see that among those with a balance, the median balance in their retirement account was $175,000. And that's comparable, I think, to the $164,000 median balance for the same age group coming from the Survey of Consumer Finances, which covers American households as a whole. So in terms of their retirement assets, they don't look so different either. Next slide. Okay, so then we wanted to look at differences by race and ethnicity, and this is motivated because there is some evidence that retirement readiness overall varies by race and ethnicity. Perhaps not surprising, given that we know that income in general varies by race and ethnicity. So we wanted to examine whether that's true for farm households as well. So we divided our farm households into 3 categories. Those where the principal operator identifies as Hispanic, those where the principal operator says they're not Hispanic and identifies as white, and those where the principal operator identifies as non-Hispanic and any other non-white race. So next slide. So we compare income levels and their sources across these 3 groups. So you can see that there aren't actually a lot of differences between Hispanic principal operator households and non-Hispanic white principal operator households in terms of their income sources. But for non-Hispanic, non-white households, they have lower levels of average farm household income. They're on average taking negative 13% of their income from the farm. So they're making losses, more likely to be making losses. And then they're more reliant on their retirement accounts, which is partially probably because they're taking losses on the farming side and taking positive income from their retirement sources. Okay, next slide. So we do the same thing comparing the underlying assets. And here we actually do see differences between Hispanic and non-Hispanic white households. So basically non-Hispanic white households have higher levels of farm assets than the other 2 groups and higher levels of retirement assets. And then when we look at the reliance, the share of assets within the farm, we see it's a little bit higher for non-Hispanic, non-whites, and their share of assets in retirement accounts is actually a little bit lower, even though we saw on the last slide, they're actually more reliant on retirement assets as their income source. Okay, next slide. And the final comparison I want to talk about today is differences based on dependency of off-farm income. So we divided the sample into 2 groups, those that receive more than 50% of their income from off-farm, and those that receive less than 50% of their income from off-farm. And as you might expect, they look really different. So those who are receiving most of their income from off-farm sources, their average household income is a lot lower. Their average retirement income is actually higher. These are older households again. Their average share of income from farming, as you obviously expect, since it's sort of based on the definition, is much lower. They're making losses of 8% versus 69% of income for those that are really reliant on farm income is coming from the farm. They're much more, those with lots of off-farm income, more reliant on retirement sources. They have more of their assets in retirement accounts and higher levels of retirement assets. So they probably look more like the average American household than, say, a larger farm operation who has less invested in those retirement accounts. Okay, next thing. Okay, so just in conclusion, this is definitely a work in progress, but we found that older farm households have relatively high levels of assets and income. The assets themselves are concentrated in the farm business, which, as has been mentioned today, are potentially illiquid sources of wealth, and individuals could be reluctant to sell them for personal reasons. They want to give the farm to a family member. And then, as has been mentioned, estate tax reasons that really, really provide a strong incentive to hold on to land until death. Major income sources for these households include private pensions, public social security, and other support, as well as interest and dividends. We see pretty broad participation among farm households in their use of retirement savings, which look relatively similar to other US households. And then we do identify some differences in assets and income by race and ethnicity of older farmers, which suggests that non-white farmers might have lower retirement resources relative to white farmers. And that's all I have today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. To keep us moving in the interest of time, next going to hear from Renee Wyatt and Maria Marshall.
Great, thanks, Shoshana. I think we can go right into the intro slide.
Yep. Okay, there we go. So like they said, we're going to talk about Rich and Ready to Go, or Stay and Grow. We're looking at succession preparedness and U.S. farmers in the North Central region. And just to note, this activity was funded by an internal grant at Purdue University called the Ag Seed.
Great, so we've heard, and somebody was asking about the difference between rural households and farm households. So our beginning slide starts off with baby boomers are retiring in record numbers. Some of them were prompted to into retirement with COVID, but overall small businesses, there's an overwhelming number of small businesses that are owned by baby boomers, and many of them don't have succession plans, and that includes farmers. So this has implications not only for farm households, but rural main streets overall in terms of the number of baby boomers and retirees. That also has an implication for how many how that age of farmers that keeps going up, right? It just kind of doesn't stop. And of course, if you look at family businesses in general, less than a third of first generation businesses survive into the second generation. It's a lot higher for our farmers if they're actually transitioning and not just restarting the farm, right? If you're kind of buying out the person and starting off, then that kind of changes. And of course, if you're an economist, you're like, well, businesses should be profit maximizing, farmers should be profit maximizing, but anybody who's actually talked to a farmer knows that that's not so. There are a lot of non-financial goals and a lot of things that get into that they're thinking of beyond just profit maximizing and making those decisions. There's also research that shows that the presence of an heir leads to growth and adaptation, and the absence leads to a decreasing emphasis on farm productivity. You can go to the next slide.
All right, so why not plan to succeed? So we pose this question kind of to guide you to start thinking about planning as a road to success. If you've talked to farmers or worked in extension, you've heard the farmer that says, I'm going to die in the tractor. But this can cause problems for the successor generation and for the rest of the family. That's obviously not what we want. But when we look at farm households overall, they are not prepared for succession. Many times it's a gap in planning, and it's on the management side. The incumbent or the senior generation in the farm is often not prepared to hand over that business to the next generation. And ultimately, they don't want to let go of those decision-making abilities that they currently have. We've heard this before today, but the average age of the American farmer in 2017 was 57.5 years. And that just continues to grow. And we've seen from research that farmers and other entrepreneurs are working way past their pension age. So they're staying in business longer. They're working longer than they have to get those Social Security benefits or other benefits that they can get. When you look at our data, we polled North Central regional farmers, and only about a third of those farmers who inherited their business consider that transfer very successful. So they have the business, but they may or may not have considered that transition successful. When we asked them why they didn't think that was successful, oftentimes they said, the timeline in succession was uncertain. It was uncertain who would be included in that succession. There were some damaged family relationships, and maybe the process wasn't what they expected as well. Next slide, please. So how can farmers in their households be successful? So step one is you have to keep the business strong enough and healthy enough to last into the next generation. And the second is to continue a healthy family into the next generation. So basically we want a profitable and efficient farm, and we want families who still celebrate holidays together. We want both of those entities to be functional and harmonious. So we looked at our data to look at when do farmers expect to retire based on their age. And as we can see, there is an inverse relationship between farmer age and years until expected retirement, which is what we want to see. Just gauging from the graph here, we can see that on average, farmers want to retire at a normal retirement age between 60 or 70. But research has shown that farmers don't retire between 60 and 70. They work a lot longer than they have to draw those benefits from retirement. So next, we're going to look at the sustainable family business model. We use this as our theoretical basis for a lot of research that we do because it does have these two entities, which are the family and the business. And oftentimes the family and the business are these two separate entities, but they're competing for resources, or they could be collaborating resources, hopefully, sometimes both. But why do we want to look at the family's role in the farm? Well, according to the 2017 Census of Ag, family farms comprise 96% of all U.S. farms. So 96% of U.S. farms are family businesses. So we like to look at the sustainable family business model to show how intertwined these resources, these constraints, these processes and achievements are in each of these entities, and how disruptions in one entity can cause disruption in the other, and how we respond to those. As we know in farm families, if there's a disruption to the family, it's going to trickle over into the farm business and vice versa. Those two entities, the family and the business, are very, very intertwined, and ultimately success in one and can lead to sustainability in the other, and vice versa.
So the other thing we were really interested in is looking at the social emotional wealth of farmers. So this social emotional wealth is considered like the distinguishing factor between a family business and a non-family business. And so it has 4 dimensions that are interrelated. One of them is transgenerational control, which is not just keeping the farm in for a long time, like one person, but actually really wanting to pass it on to another family member. So that would be transgenerational control. The other one is benevolent ties. So this could be thought of as the social capital that the farm family has in their community. The stakes they have, not only the quid pro quo that you have within the family itself, but also their community as well. The other dimension is status and reputation. And basically that's the identity and how highly a farmer is identified with that farm. And so, for example, we were working with a farm family, and the older generation, not the sandwich one, was 90 years old, and he wanted the younger generation to move to the county they were farming in, because for him, you should live with your farm, because that farm was highly identified with that family. So that's another motivation of what they're doing. The other one is affect and emotion, and that's basically how much emotion and how much they're really emotionally committed to that farm. A lot of times when you have this kind of sacrifice capital that we would have in a family business, it comes from that affect and emotion that somebody has. So they're willing to sacrifice to make sure that that farm continues in the family. So those are one of those dimensions that the social emotional wealth was something we were interested in learning on how that affects the succession planning and process. Next slide. There you go. So it does impact succession decisions. So when it comes to social emotional wealth, it's the preservation of kind of these assets, this affect and emotion that you have related to the family business. And so owners may be willing to accept a loss of this kind of stock of social emotional wealth under certain conditions. So for example, you might have a farmer that will sell a piece of land to make sure that that farm stays within the family. They might bring in a partner as long as they can maintain control of that family farm. So those are kind of like losses in that social emotional wealth, but in order to keep that family farm going. So there's this presumed trade-off between this kind of pursuit of financial wealth and this kind of preservation of social emotional wealth. If you're pursuing kind of this profit maximizing financial wealth, then that kind of finances as an output. But when you're thinking of preserving social emotional wealth, remember transgenerational control, status and reputation, affect, then you're really thinking of finances and that gross income as an input to make sure that that farm stays in the family. So there's two different ways of looking at that. And so it really affects this kind of mental readiness for the farmer to be able to retire or exit that farm. Next slide.
So when we looked at modeling this exit of the incumbent generation, we utilized this quadrant by Zellweger, and it's really judges financial and mental readiness of the incumbent or the senior generation to exit the business. So basically we have three categories here. So number one is stay and grow. That's where the farmer is not financially or mentally or emotionally, however you want to think about that, ready to exit the business. They need to stay there. They need to extract dividends, bring in maybe a partner. They need to grow the firm, improve efficiency. When we think about this stay and grow, we like to think about maybe younger farmers, or there's some reason that they're in this stay and grow process. They're not mentally or financially ready to pass that business on to the next generation. Next, for our second category, we have these people who are either financially ready or mentally ready, but not both. So they could be well off, but choose to work. So that's where they're financially ready, but they're not mentally ready to exit the business. So for some reason, you know, farmers are very high in this SEW. They're very tied to their farm. So they're well off. So financially they could retire, but they choose to work. The other kind of category in this number two group is the exit at the highest price. So these are farmers who are mentally ready to go. They're ready to get out, but they're not financially ready. So for those farmers, they need to sell the business at the highest price possible so that they can get out. And then ultimately, when farmers are nearing that retirement age, we want them to be in this third category, which is rich and ready to go. So they're financially and mentally ready to pass that business on to the next generation. And so we use those three categories to do our modeling. Here's some descriptive statistics. And so as you can see, we have these three categories. We have stay and grow, which is one, that reference category, which is where farmers are either mentally or financially ready to go, not both. And then third category is that rich and ready to go. And so this data was collected in 2023 as part of our Ag Seed grant. And it was basically just looking at farm succession and farmers in the North Central region. Some things that I want to point out here, the highest percentage of minority farmers at 32% was found in the misaligned category. So that's our reference category. Farmer age progressively increases as farmers move from that stay and grow category to the rich and ready to go category, which is what we want. When we look at that transfer of risky variable, that question was if farmers plan to transfer the business to a family successor, even if it puts their own personal wealth or livelihood at increased risk. So basically they're passing that business on, even if it could be a financial burden to them. Higher percentage of respondents say yes to this in the rich and ready to go category than the stay and grow category. The SEW scale, that's that social emotional wealth that Maria talked about. Basically it's highest in the reference category. So where those farmers are misaligned in their financial and mental readiness to go. But for our stay and grow and our rich and ready categories, SEW is about the same. And lastly, 93% of farmers in the rich and ready to go category have enough retirement to retire, which is great, but only 25% of our stay and grow category have enough to retire. And so this is just a little bit more about our data. So roughly a quarter of farmers plan to transfer the business to a family successor, even if it puts their own personal wealth and livelihood at increased risk. This really talks to that SEW that farmers have, that emotional tie they have to the farm, if they want to transfer it, even if it puts themselves at increased risk. And then roughly 39% of farmers believe that family members should make it a priority to invest in the business first, and then finance their other personal investments. So they want those business investments to come first. And here's a look at our multinomial logit results. And so we have those three categories. That misaligned category where farmers are either mentally or financially prepared, not both. That was our reference category. So some things that we want to point out here for that stay and grow category. So farmers are less likely to be in this category if they're younger in age, which makes sense. It's kind of what we expect. We think younger farmers will probably be in that stay and grow phase. Farmers are less likely to be in the stay and grow phase as their social emotional wealth increases. So there's an inverse relationship there. For the rich and ready to go category, minority farmers are less likely to be in the rich and ready to go category. Farmers are more likely to be rich and ready to go if they believe that their business investments should supersede personal investments. So that's where farmers think that they should invest in the business before personal investments. And then as SEW increases, farmers are less likely to be rich and ready to exit their business, comparable to the stay and grow category. And having enough retirement, obviously, as we would think, makes farmers more likely to be in that rich and ready to go category. And statistically, it does. I do want to point out that household income was not statistically significant to where these farmers are in these different categories. We tried log of business income. We tried percent of household income that comes from the business. And ultimately, we decided to go with household income, but it was not statistically significant. I think we'll need to hit it 3 times to get those bullet points up. Perfect. Thank you. So for our conclusions, SEW is indeed important for farmers, as we can see from our results. And as that social emotional wealth increases, farmers are not mentally prepared to exit. We know farmers in general aren't mentally and emotionally prepared for succession, but the SEW really plays an important role in that. And also there is a continued link between household finances and the exit process.
And so when we think about social emotional wealth, right, it's again about that preservation. And so when those mentally not ready, emotionally not ready to go, it's because they're like trying to preserve that social emotional wealth. And again, it's about achieving kind of sufficient financial performance to really keep that farm in the family. It's not necessarily about profit maximizing, which I believe it was Annalena in one of our previous section was talking about different ways of thinking about livelihoods and how do we think about farm livelihoods. And you know, they're thinking about financial wealth as an input. And so thinking that farmers are just thinking about profit maximizing, I think we're missing that household component and that transgenerational wealth that they're trying to build. And they're going to take less risks in terms of the things that they're doing with the farm if they're trying to preserve social emotional wealth. And usually their choices are usually based on past achievements. So hanging on to the farm and making sure that it stays in the family is based on these are the things that we did before. And so in my opinion, I don't think we're going to see that average age of farmers go down as we're seeing older and older farmers. And then we're seeing I think a big proportion of what I would call the sandwich generation in between, many Gen Xers like me that are feeling now, right? We've got a child on one end and our parents are on the other. And so this preservation of social emotional wealth of these kind of non-financial goals really has implications on how that succession planning process is going to take shape. And when we think about the sandwich generation, you know, if you think about this kind of the Teggery three circles model, and I saw that Florence had a similar 3 circles with the household. We use the ownership, the business, and the family. And so, you know, if you've got owners, you know, if you've got the farmers, right? The farmers, they've got ownership and they've got the business, but their child is not an owner per se. They're a family. They might be a family employee treated as a farm hand, but not necessarily as an owner. And so as the succession process takes longer and longer to happen, and those years take longer to stretch for that successor to be able to get into that ownership portion, you've got, again, that sandwich generation that, you know, is that in that Venn diagram in between all of those for a very short amount of time, because they're just not shifting around because the succession process is being delayed longer and longer. Next slide.
And so when we think about our implications, number one that stood out to us was, you know, how minority farmers are treated as farmers during their career really has lasting implications into retirement. In that, you know, these minority farmers are much less likely to be in that rich and ready to go category, and there has to be a reason for that. Household financial, retirement, and investment preparation, those things really matter in farm succession. Being prepared and having enough resources to retire are obviously critical. And investing in the business first contributes to farmers feeling rich and ready to go. So having a solid, strong business entity helps those farmers feel like they can exit the business and pass it on to the next generation. Social emotional wealth is vital to growing the business. So people in that stay and grow category, and also being able and prepared to retire from the farm. That social emotional wealth and all the studies we've had, really becomes a critical factor when we're looking at these decisions, why business owners hang on to their business, and also when they're ready to let that business go. And lastly, farmers in general don't feel emotionally prepared to retire from their operation. As I said before, we have farmers all the time who are just, they're in their 80s, they're in their 90s. Maybe there's 2 generations below them that haven't gotten to make those management decisions yet because that older generation is holding on and they don't feel emotionally prepared to hand over those decision-making skills and abilities and, give that to the next generation. But ultimately, age does matter in farmers being willing and able to retire. And lastly, we'll leave you with this comic. We like to end on a light note. So it says, eventually, son, you'll be in charge of all this, assuming, of course, I can't come up with a better alternative. I think that's all that we have for today.
Thank you so much, Renee and Maria. This is a really fascinating presentation and really built so well off of Catherine's presentation. And now we're going to hear from Tia McDonald.
Yeah, thank you so much. You can probably go to the next slide. Great. So yeah, my name's Tia McDonald. I'm a research economist at ERS. Today, I'll be presenting some joint work that I've been working on with Noah Miller, also at ERS. So we're generally interested in the commercial banking sector and access to banking services for rural and farm households. And this is particularly salient given that there's been consolidation in the banking sector and net closures of bank branches we're seeing in the data from about 2015 to 2021 to the current year, with an uptick after the start of the pandemic. So this particular research project that I'll present today focuses on financial services that the household side of the farm household may use. And so we're looking at this kind of geographic access in terms of, how does the distance to your nearest commercial bank influence how likely you are to use some certain financial services. So why, generally are financial services important to farm households? Firstly, we can think about financial services as an important source of credit for households. If you think about a household experiencing a shock, like kids need braces or the car breaks down, you might look to sources of credit to weather those shocks. These financial services can also create wealth streams independent of farm earnings. We've talked about, over the course of the day, we've heard this many times, but farm returns are volatile year after year, and the median household farm income tends to be negative. And so this means that households depend primarily on off-farm wages and also, to a lesser extent, returns, at least kind of passive income in the form of returns from dividend and interest income. And on the wealth side, farm household wealth is comprised of farm assets and non-farm assets. And so, that overall wealth picture is going to depend on how well those farm assets grow and how well those retirement and non-retirement financial assets grow. So this chart just gives us a sense of what the median household farm income has looked like over about 6 years. So starting in 2015, that's the red bar. You can see that it hovers around 0, but it's negative more often than not. The black bar gives us a sense of median income from off-farm financial sources, so interest and dividend income. And so this tends to be positive, and that's kind of motivating some of what we're looking at today. Next slide. We're going to focus on 3 financial accounts that you might access at a commercial bank. The first are non-retirement financial assets. So this includes cash and savings, but also certificate of deposits, mutual funds, stock bonds, those types of things. The next account are retirement financial assets, so IRAs, 401ks, those kinds of things. And then the last are personal loans. So this is, setting that farm business aside, this is something that the household might access in terms of credit card debt, auto loans, medical bills, that kind of thing. We're going to present statistics by region, and to give you a sense of what those regions look like, here's the map. So the West states are in red, Plains are in yellow, Midwest are in that green speckled, Atlantic in mustard, and the South is in blue. Our data comes from the Agricultural Resource Management Survey. Again, we've heard about this a lot today. We're using years 2015 through 2021. And we're also using the universe of bank branches from the FDIC Summary of Deposits data. And so together with our sister agency, NASS, we've been able to calculate the distance from each farm household in our data set to the nearest commercial bank. And also we have statistics about the number of banks within 5, 10, and 25 miles. So to give a sense of concentration. So what we're interested in initially is just to really examine the relationship between the likelihood of having these financial accounts and the distance to the nearest bank, while controlling for other factors that are important when we think about likelihood of having financial assets or personal loans. So that includes things like age, education, internet access, race and ethnicity, last year's income, region, and the survey year. We use a probit analysis, so this can accommodate a binary dependent variable. So it's going to be equal to 1 if the farm household has that certain financial account and 0 otherwise. So I have a number of charts just to show you kind of what the data looks like by region over years. So as the bars get darker, we get closer to the present year. And so this is the share of farm households with those non-retirement financial assets. And so you can see, on average, more than 60% have these financial assets. Although the South kind of displays this interesting pattern that we're going to see repeated in other charts. So there's this decrease in the share of households in the South, farm households in the South that have these financial assets, and then kind of a rebuilding of that from about 2018 on. Next slide. These 2 charts are meant to give you a sense of what these non-retirement financial assets look like. And so on the left, we have the share of farm households in showing you the by category of their asset value. So this shows that about 50% of farm households have these non-retirement financial assets between 1 and 25,000. So kind of low levels of financial assets. About 10% each have between 25 and 50, 50 and 100, 100 and 150, and then about 20% have more than 150,000 in these non-retirement financial assets. And so something that's unique and important about these non-retirement financial assets is they can be a source of income all by themselves, right? This passive income in the form of interest and dividend income. And so the chart on the right shows us that the majority of farm households with these financial assets earn zero interest or dividend income. Smaller and smaller shares earn higher amounts of this passive income, with 2% and 3% earning more than $10,000 each year in interest and dividend income. So this chart shows you the share with these retirement financial assets over time. It is the most stable at just over 60% in the Midwest. We do see that similar pattern in the South, and pretty high, at least higher than I would expect, variability in other regions, considering that, you know, retirement assets tend to be, you know, if you're in financial distress, some of the last, you know, your last avenues for kind of liquidating. Next slide. So this is what the retirement financial assets look like on average. So about 20% of farm households have between 1 and 25,000 in retirement financial assets. And it's pretty evenly dispersed across this distribution. So, you know, a little more than 20% have 300,000 or more in their retirement accounts. And this is this last chart showing you this is the share with personal loans, again over time and by region. And I'd say the main takeaway here is that it's highly variable. Again, we're seeing that same kind of almost V shape in the South, which I think is just really interesting and, you know, a source of, you know, possible future research. But besides that, we are seeing some variability over time. So this chart summarizes some of our distance data. So like I talked about up top, we have this these calculated distances from the farm household to the nearest commercial bank. And so over time, you know, from 2015 to 2020, the average distance to the nearest bank is pretty stable, even though there's these net closures, right? The net closures have tended to be more concentrated in metro areas, and so less likely to impact farm households, except that from 2020 to 2021 and beyond, we see this significant uptick in the number of bank branch closures. And so we can really see that reflected in the data here, where farm households in the Midwest and South, the average distance to the nearest bank almost doubles, or just about doubles. And the average distance to the nearest bank for those in the plains increased significantly too. So I'm going to take you through the results, kind of line by line. I know it's a lot of numbers to just throw at you. So let's do what I'm hoping is the next slide is this first bar. Yes. Oh, great. So the first row here shows us that the distance to the nearest bank is negatively associated with having these non-retirement financial accounts and retirement financial accounts, but doesn't seem to be related to the likelihood of having personal loans. The next one. All right, great. So we included age and age squared because we would expect that over time, you know, the likelihood of having these financial accounts should increase at a decreasing rate, which is what we find here, and that's true across all financial accounts. Next. education seems to be positively related to the probability of having these accounts, although in thinking about whether that location decision for the farm household, whether proximity to a city may be related to your returns to the labor market. And so when we think about, just being really careful here to interpret these results as kind of correlations or associations, and we haven't reached the level of causal analysis that Ali talked about earlier. So this is one of our goals for future research. Next. The share of farms with internet access certainly seems to have an impact on the likelihood of having these financial assets, both non-retirement and retirement. To the extent that this is a perfect substitute for that brick and mortar bank, we don't know. It seems that, even while controlling for the kind of internet access, that this distance to the bank seems to matter, but that's also something that we want to explore with future research. Next. Like others have talked about, race and ethnicity seems to be a factor here. We find that a Hispanic or non-white principal operator is less likely to have retirement and non-retirement financial assets, but there's no statistical association when considering personal loans. And then lastly, off-farm wage. We find that there's a positive association here between off-farm wage and all of these financial services. So, we would expect, given that many jobs, one of the benefits, additional benefits of many jobs is employer-funded retirement accounts. And so we would expect that off-farm wage would be associated with having those retirement assets, but we find that it's also associated with non-retirement financial assets and personal loans. All right, so we, just to give a sense of sort of the marginal effect here of this, and it's just an association, but for every 1% increase in the distance to the nearest bank, we're finding that it's about a 2% decrease in the 2 to 2.5% decrease in the likelihood of having non-retirement and retirement financial assets. And then you can see personal loans seems to be pretty much unrelated to the distance to the bank. Just some general kind of preliminary conclusions at this point. We do find this negative association between bank distance and the farm household's likelihood of having these retirement and non-retirement financial assets. And it has particular implications for regions with the decreasing bank presence. And one of the things that we'd like to do is think about sort of the most at-risk areas of the country in terms of low internet availability and low bank presence as being sort of this, describing maybe the most at risk in terms of having access to financial assets. So one of the things that we want to do in future research is really investigate the degree to which internet availability is a substitute for those brick and mortar banks. And also the extent to which that proximity to a labor market and proximity to bank branches might be simultaneously determined. These are some resources that you can avail yourself of if you'd like to keep track of what's going on at ERS. And with that, I am done.
Thank you, Tia. So if all the presenters want to turn on their cameras, this is a really fascinating session, and honestly, I feel like it's the perfect way to end our presentations because it's really a full circle where so many of the themes that came up were things that connected to the way that Doug Jackson Smith's presentation about farm entry and exit, and also just Tia, what you were even just presenting about bank closures and the loss potentially of local banks and communities, and what do the significance of community institutions that were brought up during the panel with farmers this morning, right? And what are those kinds of things for workforce attraction and retention in our rural communities, and the role of banks. So this has been really something fascinating to listen to all of you. So I had a couple questions, and then I see that there's a number of questions and comments in the chat as well. So when I was listening to all of these presentations, I was also thinking about like what's to be done with this research, like what are the next steps? And most generally for like the general household, the general population, we've had a loss of home economics in schools being taught, right? So thinking about retirement and household planning. And today, like in the US, basically retirement can be determined based upon how good of a financial planner you are as an individual, or if you have enough money to work with a financial planner. And then I think about the type of curriculum that's included in farm business classes and our tech centers and in colleges and universities for young farmers. And I'm wondering, how do your findings and the research that you're doing, like how do you reflect on or think about the types of education that we're providing for young farmers when it comes to accounting and thinking about retirement and succession and business curriculum? And what does your research, how can your research inform some of that practice? And whoever would like to start on that one.
Well, I'm happy to start, I guess. I won't be shy. So one of the things that I've noticed is, for example, in farm management classes, just at the university, it's a lot on farm productivity, management of risk, but the family part is barely mentioned. Is usually if you bring out an outside speaker, they talk about, oh, how hard it is to work with, 2 generations or 3 generations together. And that dynamic between the family and the farm isn't really talked about, and how to have harder conversations. How are different personalities going to work together, and how do they get through that? And that becomes the biggest obstacle to succession planning, because if you can't have a conversation, you can't really do the next step. And when I was sending students back to talk to their parents about when was it that they were going to have management decision making, one of them came back, well, grandpa dies. It's one, right? Or their parents didn't want to talk, and they're like, well, you have to. Dr. Marshall said you have to fill this out. So I think that component, bringing that component back into I think we used to do that when, the AJA was some like farm journal or something, but bringing that component back into farm management to me would be a practical thing that we can do to get this process started.
Thanks, Maria.
I guess I don't have a lot to say on the topic, not being an expert in sort of how we're educating farmers, but I guess when looking at the assets and the income and thinking about how different it is to plan for retirement for people who are getting a lot of their income off farm, it sounds like, I'm not sure if the education is really separate for the farm business versus like the household finances, but it feels like those need to be brought together, especially when thinking in terms of taxes, minimizing estate taxes, and thinking about like where you should be allocating your resources, investing in the farm versus saving in your 401k and getting your employer match. It does seem like those need to be integrated, because you need to optimize them together, I guess. That's all I would say.
Thanks, Catherine.
One of the things that kind of surprised me in our research is that there's the high share that have like these financial assets that aren't generating any income. And we've been in this environment with really low interest rates for a pretty long time. And so I think that, there might be this kind of reminding people that, they might be leaving some money on the table if they're just, keeping a bunch of money in their checking account and, not taking advantage of, trying to get some additional income streams that, just might, I think we might might have gotten out of that practice in this kind of low interest environment, but we're not there anymore. We're in this high interest environment, and so people can be maybe taking advantage of that.
Thanks, Tia. Renee, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think in general, when we're thinking about these young farmers, like going back and trying to start having some decision making in the farm, I think it's kind of piggybacking off what Maria said, but just teaching students and these young farmers to feel empowered to have those critical conversations. A lot of times they're too scared to ask the questions that they need to know that actually impact their own life and what they can do going forward. But just empowering them to start those conversations early and to talk to the other generations in their family often to get those answers that they need.
Thanks, Renee. So one other question that I had was that, in almost all the studies, the significance of diversity within the farm population really came out, right? And we know that our farm population is diverse across demographics, such as race, ethnicity, and sex. And I'm wondering, as you reflect on your research and results, what do these studies mean for the approaches that we have to succession among a heterogeneous population? And maybe how could we be doing a better job about accounting for the differences within our farm population in our approaches to succession? And farm business in general.
So I think, for us, we found that those minority farmers were less likely to be in that rich and ready to go category. And so I don't know if there is something structurally that is somehow built in to these systems that we have that is hindering them from being rich and ready to go. But I think that having an emphasis on those minority farmers and having programming that caters to them, whether it be in a different language or catering to their cultural needs, whatever that is, I think that needs to be more integrated into the assistance that we're providing, both, in the banking sector, in extension, in research, just making sure we're catering to everybody.
Thanks,
Yes,
Renee.
I guess I would say one thing that we're working on wasn't in the presentation is kind of looking at things by farm typology. And so I think earlier in the conference, as Jeff Hopkins mentioned, that's the intersection kind of on whether the principal operator is, mainly off farm or mainly working on farm, and then cross with how large, say, the farm operation is. And I think that typology kind of tells you about the diversity of farm households. And I think that what we're seeing in our results is basically like there's people who are doing off-farm stuff and they're saving for retirement. Maybe they look like other US households, and that's perhaps a good thing because we have 401ks matching, we have tax credits, all these things to promote retirement savings. Then we have the really big farmers that you saw, the people relying on a lot on farm income, and they're maybe have high levels of assets, high levels of wealth. Maybe we're less worried about them when thinking about retirement security, but it's really, I think, coming out in the typology, the people who are mainly farming, so they don't have those off-farm necessarily income sources and have less in retirement accounts coming from that, but they're not big. So they're not making a lot from their farm business. And so that might be a group that we would be particularly concerned about. So that's a direction we're moving with the project that wasn't in the presentation today.
Thanks, Catherine. Maria or Tia, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $1 million question. How to help BIPOC farmers grow and like Renee said, get ready for retirement. And one of the things, I mean, one of the things that I noted in our presentation was that V shape in the South, right, where you see kind of this drawing down of resources and then building back up, and research has suggested that people of color tend to use the USDA and commercial banks as sort of the last resort. They're more likely to go and collateralize or liquidate their own resources, go to family members, try to get resources from all these other possibilities before, really making use of these sort of more traditional lenders. And so, that means that can be a barrier to growth, right? There's only so many resources you can drum up from your community and family, and by liquidating your retirement account and things like that. So I mean, this is just one tiny facet of a very complex mosaic of what in terms of barriers to growth and readiness, and trying to get into that rich and ready to go category that Renee and Maria talked about. But there's just one that popped into my mind.
Thanks, Tia.
Yeah, and I think the renewed emphasis on heirs property, that's one of the ways that I think we're starting to kind of think about retirement and succession as kind of like this very, there's just a lot of diversity of ways that people might get to that, and thinking of the different options that people have, and not assuming, I think as somebody was saying, intra-family succession, that might be to somebody the first, but that's not the only option. And so kind of thinking about how do we guide people to what's their best option based on how they think that they can exit. And I think looking at that besides heirs property and other things that we need to do to make sure that we're not doing a one size fits all, which is how we've tended to think, I think, particularly in AgriCon, I can only speak for AgriCon, kind of this intra-family succession, that's the only way and the right way. And I think Julia Valiant earlier in another session had said about, these kind of traditional models of exiting, and that we should be more open to all kinds of possibilities of how people might decide to get out of farming and get into farming.
So that I want to make sure that we have time. I have so many more questions, but there's a number of questions in the chat that I want to make sure that we get to. And based on Maria, what you just ended with, I want to go to Claire's question or comment about if there's any observations or evidence from your research on the relationship of farmer SCW to receptivity, oh my gosh, to readiness for considering succession by non-family members. Much of the material seems to assume inter-family succession, and farm transfer is always preferred and possible. What is successful succession and transfer outside of the family?
We actually ask what they want to do, if it's going to be given to a family member, sold to a family member, sold outside of the family, or liquidated. That's also an option that we provide in that survey. And so usually the higher the social emotional wealth, the more apt they are to say they're going to give or sell to a family member, much less likely to liquidate. Obviously, there's a lot of emotion at that. So there's much less likely to liquidate. And then it goes off and on depending on the assets, whether they're going to sell to outside of the family. But it definitely has implications on which option they choose to kind of exit and retire out.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's interesting too, like all of these presentations, just in terms of that, inter-family, it makes me think about also just the new agricultural ladders that have been created in recent periods where people are not just, inheriting their family farms, but how do we think about this importance and significance of the way that farmers are creating wealth for retirement, and how might that be different in the ways that folks were talking about earlier in terms of new models like co-ops, and where there's not just one family but then there's multiple folks, and I don't know if any of your research for anybody on the panel has been thinking about that or engaging with that at all. No. Catherine, that's the next question we need in your retirement data analysis. It's for the governance of the farm. Okay, Tatiana had some questions about looking at the number of years a principal operator has been farming, if they can identify inherited versus first generation farms to look at experiences in farming.
Yeah, so we cannot identify, I don't think, first generation versus inherited farms, but we can identify number of years that the operator has been in business. So we could look at that and see how that relates to their asset distribution. Be interesting controlling for age. We might be able then to, that's interesting, maybe different, but I mean, you could look at how the experience in farming affects like the distribution of assets, whether they're more heavily invested in farm assets, if they've been farming longer, which I think would be interesting.
Yeah, I think the only the data source that at the national level that we might have some insight here, it would be the flip side from the total survey, where they ask landowners about their succession plans. So it would be kind of pre-succession, but how do you plan to, or well, first, do you plan to transfer your land in the next 10 years, and then how do you intend to do that? So that survey is done every 5 years, I think. 2017 was the last one, so we're coming up on a new total survey, so maybe some updated information.
2014 was the last one, but yes, they're doing one in 2024, I believe. So I think that'll be interesting. They also ask about like non-operator landlords, which I think one big missing data piece in this for me is like fully retired farmers, right? Like I mentioned, ARMS is only covering people who are still producing. So what are people doing when they're just totally out of farming? Or they're not an operator anymore? Maybe they still own land, maybe they're getting rental payments. That would, I think, show up in some of the total in the total survey, because they would own land. Looking at landowners. And then also, to Maria's point, like income sharing, I'm curious about for retired. If you're giving your farm or selling it to a family member, is there some sort of agreement for you to get some income from that farm operation, even though you're technically not an operator anymore? So those types of things we can't really look at in ARMS because it's just not part of the sampling thing.
So I guess I'm also just curious to hear from each of you. What's the core kernel that you hope folks take away from your research? I can start calling on folks if nobody's gonna unmute first. Catherine, I see you first, so.
That's a difficult question. I guess I was surprised, and this is probably because so far we haven't done as much on, like I said, the typology and looking at the diversity of experiences, but I was surprised at how similar farm households looked to American households in general. I was expecting to see sort of more differences in terms of their reliance on retirement income sources. Like I was thinking that they would be getting more from their farm assets or farm business, but perhaps I should have known, given that there's so much off-farm activity, that they might look like other American households. So I think that would be I don't know if that's the core finding or the most surprising finding for me.
Well, thanks for sharing your reflection.
I'll go next. Yeah, this is a tricky or difficult question. Just I think for Noah and I, our work is kind of in progress, and so this sits in sort of a larger effort that we're trying to really describe changes in the farm geography over time and how access to services has changed. And so this is just one facet of that. But in terms of we often think about farms as being kind of independent and resilient, and the dependence or the need for services is real. And looking at this tiny little corner of this entire system of services that support farm households, we're really finding that distance to the bank matters, even though we have internet access and things like that. So this kind of network of services that support farm households are really important, and we'll keep researching.
Thanks, Tia.
So I think that for our research, and being in extension and research for a long time, we've thought, farmers are not mentally and emotionally ready to retire. But I think this study kind of got to the why are they not ready? And that comes into that social emotional wealth and that feeling, that affect they have to the farm. And basically the love they have for their farm is making them not want to let it go. And I think we showed that statistically. And I think it's interesting, but it comes into this fact that we need to start succession planning and those conversations early and often, and have a plan to try to get people, especially the incumbent generation, thinking about retirement and what that looks like for them, and start to integrate those next generations into the operation.
Thanks, Renee.
So I think for me, the fact that, a lot of times when we've done studies of farmers just in Indiana, we don't have enough of a diverse number of farmers. And so with this one going to the North Central region, we were able to have enough BIPOC farmers to be able to actually tease out some differences. And the fact that it kind of reconfirms some of those structural things that are happening that inhibit BIPOC farmers from actually being able to successfully farm, or at least feel that, because really it's a feeling. Do you feel like you're rich and ready to go, right? And so that's not there, and so that's something that I hope we can continue to look at.
So maybe just as a follow-up question, who else do you want to be part of these conversations and part of the research that you're doing as you look to expand out from these particular studies? How would you want to build your teams out, both in terms of additional research partners and practitioners?
Well, I would love to work more with the Policy Center that is doing a lot of work on heirs property. And I think we work a lot with the Southern Regional Rural Development Center. So I'll give a plug for the Regional Rural Development Centers. They're doing a lot of work on heirs property as well. So that would, I think they would be an excellent partner.
Thanks, Maria.
I would just say, as an economist, today's conference has been really enlightening in thinking about what can economics bring to thinking about. We always think about profit maximization, we always think about utility maximization. Thinking about utility maximization, take into things besides profit, obviously. But there's a lot of aspects, it feels like, to this topic and farm households in general that just calls, I think, for an interdisciplinary approach, at least in terms of interpreting some of the results. So that's kind of that's how I would want to build up my team. People with other backgrounds and expertise.
Yeah, I would just echo that. This has been really, really hopeful and just learning about other perspectives and I think just in terms of networking with people that I haven't had contact with, or haven't had the experience of talking to or collaborating with. This has been a really great opportunity to reach across kind of those discipline silos and those other silos that we can find ourselves in. Yeah, just really appreciate it.
Renee?
Yeah, I think as we think more about trying to have a broader reach and impact of our research, I think it would be more interesting to pull in these interdisciplinary teams. I mean, I'm thinking even like sociologists, psychologists into this particular study to see why farmers act the way they do, to see if we can get to the root of that and try to help get them resources in whatever way that looks, to help them to overcome some of those barriers they might have. But I'll echo what the other panelists said. This has been a great conference and a lot of information shared.
So Mary asked, does NIFA have a regional research group on this topic? Maria, I don't know, is yours the closest, the one that you lead, or is there another that works on these topics?
I think there's another one as well, but I belong to the NC 1030 group, which works on family businesses and rural households, and has for like over, well, I've been here for 20 years, so probably I think over 30 to 40 years. They've been around since the 80s and have been a continual multi-state with succession planning, because it's still going. That was not there in the 80s. But that would be the NC 1030 would be one that works on some of these issues. Mhm.
It looks like Christopher Brown with ALBA. Christopher, do you want to unmute yourself at all and share a little bit about the work that you're doing with transitioning Latino farm workers into farm ownership, and if there was anything that you wanted to share?
It's hard, but I appreciate this research because we've got major problems. We have a human resource problem in terms of the aging farmers and gradually having distanced ourselves from farming as careers over probably the last century. So the question is who's going to farm, right? And we're open to everyone, but the people who come in droves are the Mexican immigrants and first generation Latinos, because they have they do have ag careers and a lot of exposure to agriculture from a very young age. And that can be, those skills can be honed into farm ownership. As we've seen in our program, we have a 20-year impact assessment just coming out now, so we can send that over and you can pass it around. But we want to be part of the discussion for sure. There's too many barriers, too much risk in starting up a farm, and very intense competition on pricing because of industrialized agriculture. So somehow our farmers are doing it on like 15 acres, using family labor and selling into direct markets and local wholesalers, and they're doing quite well.
Chris, thanks so much for sharing a little bit more about your work and putting your contact information in, which is great, so that we can all follow up. And thanks also for everybody's been putting in reflections in the chat. It's been really helpful to read these and to think about all of these different components around, so both physical and social infrastructure that's needed for supporting both farmers, farm workers, and all the folks who work across the food and agricultural supply chain. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Martha so she can guide us through the next phase of the conference.
Sure. Thanks, Shoshana. Thank you, everyone, again, for your observations, thoughts, the research that's been shared. It's been a great conference day. So we're going to end the day with those final reflections and everything that we've learned. Again, our sincere thanks to all of our co-organizers for making this event possible. National Farm Medicine Center, Ohio State, Colorado State, USDA, ERS. For now, yes, there's a question in the chat about the recordings. Yes, we will post these to the Farm Foundation YouTube channel and our social media channels in the next few days. I'll talk about that a little more at the very end, but I think I'm going to hand it over now, I think, to Florence. Is she on? To kind of share a little bit more here at the end.
Thanks, Martha. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So we have just a few more minutes, about 20 minutes, where we wanted to spend some time reflecting and thinking about the next steps a little bit. So when Shoshana opened this morning, one of the things that she talked about was that today was about a paradigm shift. It was about turning our attention to the ways in which social and household needs affect farm well-being, sustainability, resilience in the farm sector. It was also about moving away from the overemphasis on the farm business and on the economics of the farm business. So throughout the day, throughout the panel, throughout the research papers, we heard from a range of social and economic needs and how those are intersecting with the farm business. For example, we heard about healthcare, health insurance, retirement, housing, income, the children, finances, and even student debts in the morning panel. So before I turn to our organizing groups to provide some of their closing thoughts, I have 4 things for all of you. The first thing is that a major goal of this conference was to start a conversation on the topic and to develop new networks. We encourage folks to get in touch with each other. Online, you can see who had signed up. I know that Farm Foundation is also thinking about, are there ways to share the contact information of everyone, given that we might not have given consent for those contact information to be shared, but I think they're working on it. As an organizing group, we certainly plan on continuing the conversation. And one of the ways that we're going to do that is through a special issue in the journal Agriculture and Human Values. For those of you who are here with us today and who are engaging in research that you feel is on this topic, we encourage you to take a look at the call for papers for the special issue. The call is on the website, on the conference website, if you have not seen it. And in short, the abstracts are due on September 18, and invitations for full paper will be sent around September 25th. This morning, Shoshana asked us to think about 3 different questions throughout the day. And at this time, what we wanted to do is we wanted to invite all of you who are here to share your thoughts on these questions. And I'm going to put them in the chat. And I know that there's been already some reflections happening in the last session. But essentially, those questions were: in what ways are your experiences similar or different from what you have heard today? What are you hearing that surprised you? And how might you change your approach to the work that you do in the food and agricultural sector? So at this time, I invite everyone to share their thoughts as they would like. And then the last thing that I have for you all is that during lunch, we also had discussion. We had a networking lunch where some of us got together around a series of topics. And what we wanted to do, and the last question that we had for the group, one of the things that we asked about is, what are the pieces of information that you want to bring back to the USDA, Farm Foundation, as well as the organizing group? And so I wanted to highlight some of the things that folks have said during the discussion groups. So a few folks talked about, it sounded like some of the folks talked about really enjoying the opportunity to interact with different folks and who approach these issues through many different disciplines, through different approaches. Some folks might be outreach-oriented, research-oriented, some folks might work for the government, for the private sector, but there was that appreciation for that systems approach to thinking about the social and economic needs of farm families. We heard some about the need for more research into the complexity in which the ways farms are owned and operated. And to that point too, on research, there was a question around how do we better weave and read different quantitative and qualitative data sets, and also the different programs and fundings that are available across different agencies to support the economic and social sustainability and quality of life of farmers and farm workers. So those were some of the key themes that came up. And then for the last thing we wanted to do is pose 1 question to the folks on the organizing group, if they want to unmute and to turn their cameras on. And the questions for those of you who've been talking together for the last few months is, what are the 1 or 2 things you will want other researchers, farm service providers, policymakers to take away from today? And I can start calling names. I see the names. So.
So I'm just going to add that my takeaway is that these issues are real and that the moment is to talk about them and to not just research, but also invest in programs and policies that can support the social sustainability issues and quality of life issues in the farm sector. I think the fact that that there were 437 registrants today just goes to demonstrate how salient these issues are now, and that there's a real moment for us all to continue to collaborate and network and figure out collectively what are the next steps are, and to stay in touch.
Thank you, Shoshana. Catherine, I see you.
I guess I think I have mentioned to some people that I'm kind of new to this agriculture space. And I think it's interesting to me to think about how farm households are the same or different from other American households, because we've talked about how, there are programs and policies that are out there to support health insurance access, to support childcare access. And so I think thinking about what are the unique challenges for farm households and where do we need specific programming to help them versus where can we connect with other researchers that are working in these areas, not necessarily on farm households, maybe they're working in rural spaces or even urban environments, and thinking about more what policies need to be targeted versus I think more general policies that can, work for farm households more generally.
Thanks, Katie.
Hi, I'll jump in. This is Amber. One of the things, hi Shoshana, one of the things that was a major takeaway for me is really more of a confirmation. One, that this is a prevalent issue. As Shoshana said, we had this large number of people who are registered, but the knowledge that was just shared, even just among us that participated, shows that I don't know if it's as much data as needed. More so, we need to concentrate on practical application, common sense. There's no data for common sense. And let's work together to continue to share best practices across platforms like this on a more regular basis, so that then you get the real impact of the strategies and things that we come up with, that the community comes up with, that we serve. And I would like to even see more people from the community, the farming community, to participate, not just us who are providing supportive services. But I definitely love the way this whole thing was set up. Thank you for the invite, and I hope that we can do this even if it's twice a year, but this should be a regular flow event that we should do more than once a year. Thank you.
Thanks, Amber. Thanks so much for that comment. And I want to say, Zoe in the chat said something similar. Is it more data that we need, or are we ready for action? Ashley, I see your camera is on, Ashley. Do you want to chime in?
I was just gonna follow up what Katie said. I think, a lot of these issues, especially stuff that we saw, affects the broader population as well. And so I think, figuring out where things need to be farm specific and where we tap into the work other people are doing. Specifically for me, the stuff on the discrepancies and differences we saw on retirement assets and retirement savings across different racial groups. I mean, those same disparities exist across the board. You see that in the GAO report we cited. And so I think, in some of these issues are farm specific, and some in like these, race and financial access to financial resources and financial literacy. I mean, that's a broader issue than just farming. And I don't know that focusing on farming specifically, when we could be tapping into, the larger, I guess, issue there on racial disparities and wealth.
Thank you. Great. Thanks, Ashley. Jeff, you didn't present today, but I see that you stayed up for a long time to be here from Germany. Would you like to chime in?
Thanks, Florence. Yeah, really pleased with the turnout. Like I said, I've gotten so many ideas from the research that's been presented here and from the comments by the audience. And I really think that we can work together to develop new lines of research. I really liked what Tia was saying, that this is kind of a larger conversation about services, and maybe our data right now is strongest, or at least the ERS data that we're looking at from ARMS is strongest in the financial area, but we can think about how to, and starting, you know, with health, but some other social services, you know, really in order to meet our mandate of understanding and measuring what drives farm household well-being, we need to understand access to services and barriers that may exist. So I'm really hopeful and want to be helpful to the researchers who are wanting to look at these issues more in depth. So thank you to the participants.
Thank you, Jeff. We had other members from our organizing team, but I think they might have they were not able to stay till the end. And these folks included Jessica Crow from USDA, as well as Ali Bowman and Becca Jablansky from CSU. Before we close things up, does anyone from the audience would like to unmute themselves and also add something to conclude our day together? And Elena, I saw you put something in the chat box. Would you like to talk about it?
Yeah, just to say that it seems like a call for coalition building is in order, given, you know, what people are saying about how a lot of these issues are true for other American households. And we don't even need to look that broadly, but thinking about, you know, food chain workers, farm workers, you know, people across the agriculture and food sector, that seems like a huge area of opportunity to really build momentum for talking about addressing some of these social and economic needs.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elena.
Florence, can I jump in? It's Zoe.
Yeah.
I was wondering so I had put something in the chat and Gail had responded to it, this idea about policymakers needing this info and how to best accomplish this. And I was just wondering if you or Shoshana would be willing to speak to your recent work on this and childcare, and what ways you see for people here who are interested in doing similar types of work, a little bit about the practical kind of aspect of how you got some of that done. I find it really impressive, and think other people might be interested to hear that too.
Thanks, Zoe. I can start, and then Shoshana, you can add to it. I would say it's been a lot of different things, right? It's been a lot of really thinking about how do we translate our research well outside academic journals, but really thinking about how do we make it into a digestible format. One of the things that we've done is we've done research briefs, and we try to keep them to one page, and then we disseminate them broadly. I would say Shoshana is excellent at emailing people out of the blue and saying, hey, check this out, check out the findings of our research. One thing too that I think has brought a lot of attention to the issues has been writing articles for the Conversations. And the Conversation is this, for folks who are not familiar, is a media outlet that specifically works for researchers to translate their findings to a broader audience. Shoshana, what else have we done?
No, thanks, Florence. That's great. I think some of the other things, just to build on what you were saying, is just doing a lot of engagement and talking to a lot of colleagues, both fellow academics, but then also a lot of practitioners and in the nonprofit sector, and saying, this is what we're finding. How is this ringing true for what you're seeing? But then also involving them in the research process, so that there's kind of there's a co-creation there, so that we're all seeing the data as it's coming in and making sense of it. And I think, because we walk a fine line in academia between research and policy and advocacy, right? Like, it's really been also about talking to our nonprofit partners and saying, you know, we have this research, who should we be sharing with this in government? And then they'll say, oh, this is the senator who you should talk to, and this is the aide that you should talk to. And then, you know, we arrange for research briefings by reaching out. And I think a lot of times what we've found is that folks in government are most of the time they're bombarded by folks who are just complaining, right? And when you go and you say, wait, I have some like good news and I have a solution, or not a solution, but I have data that you might find useful. And you're giving something very constructive, that it's been a very, you know, constructive conversation, and it's been something that we've used to build relationships with.
Thanks, Shoshana. And then one thing too I say is that we've been strategic too in terms also using the research process through key informal interviews, and that is by including decision makers into our research process to understand their perspectives. But that's also been a strategy for folks to get to know in these positions of decisions, to get to know about the project and then kind of follow the project along as we go. It's 3:50 here, Central Time. Any other thoughts before I pass the mic on to Martha? Rebecca, I see you came on.
I was just going to chime in and say that I think that this topic of childcare is an interesting space where we can bring the conversation about farmers and farm workers together. I've been doing research with our Latino farm workers here in Idaho for many years, and childcare is like one of the biggest issues that they're struggling with in terms of managing all the different forms of labor, right? And so I think that that is an exciting space where we might think about bridging some of the challenges and also speaking into that policy space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Rebecca. All right, Martha. So again, thank you everyone for coming today. It's been an exciting day to learn from everyone. And then Martha, thank you for ending this for us today.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thanks again to the co-organizers. And with that, we will conclude the conference.